Welcome to the Sparta Forge and Anvil Museum. My name is Yvonne Taylor and I am a hand spinner. I would like to give you a little history of spinning and wool care. Years ago, everyone had to have a spinner in the family, and also the family had to help out with the whole process of getting it ready to spin and then to knit or weave. Pioneers had a long day of washing and teasing the wool like this after it was washed. But first of all, I'll tell you how it was washed. The sheep were shorn in the spring. When they took the raw fleece, they would lay it out on the grass and pull away all the dirty stuff and throw it out. They would take the rest of it and wash it very carefully several times in hot water to get it very clean, lay it out on the fence or on bushes or on the grass to dry it out. After that, they would pick up the wool and start what they call teasing it, like this. And this is to get all the little bits of grass and hay or straw that might be in it. Any little bits and pieces of burrs or whatever. Then you get it all pulled apart like this. Then you would take your carding brushes, which are brushes on either side with little wires on them, and you would brush the fibers so they're all going in one direction. You do this a couple of times, maybe pick out a few other little bits and pieces that might still be in there. Like this. A little hard on the wrists after a while. So there we have some wool all ready to spin. So I've already got some started here. So you push the wheel away from you and you basically pull and slide and pinch. Pull, slide, and pinch. And all the fibers are in the same direction and getting wound around. The kids had to help out washing and teasing the wool because it was a very long process to get all of this made into yarn so that they could make all their clothing and all their linens, but it was a very long, hard thing to do. Two different colors. I put them on a little rack and put both yarns inside again and turn my wheel the other way to ply it so it'll be twice as strong and twice as thick, which would make it last longer. Wool is pretty strong. We put it onto a skein winder or a wool winder, and it would measure it all out and end up like this. Here is a 2-ply, basically hand-spun yarn that your ancestors would have used in the old days. This is a typical pair of men's socks that would have been made in the old days. I'm going to demonstrate an antique sock machine, or auto knitter as they used to call them. This auto knitter is 100 years old. It was made during the turn of the last century, around 1900, for ladies to make some money at home. So they could make some socks and send them away to a manufacturer or to somebody to sell them. Anyway, they are still in use today. You can buy new ones today, but I love this old one of mine. It has 60 needles on here for a 60 stitch sock. It will make one whole sock. I can make a pair of socks finished in about an hour and a half. Anyway, I will show you what's happening here. And you crank it just like the old meat grinders. Here is the cuff that I start with, down the leg to the heel. There is the heel where I use half of the needles, and I just go back and forth, decreasing and then increasing to make this bump. Then I go back down, see how long I make it for whatever sized shoe I'm making it for. I make another bump, basically. It's still the same thing as a heel, and that is the toe. I just have to sew up those last stitches. Then I start another sock with another cuff down the leg to the heel, down there to the toe. They have weights on the bottom to hold the whole sock onto the needles so they don't slip off as I'm going around. Otherwise, there would be a lot of time spent picking up stitches. This is a typical sock that is made today, these two. During the war, both wars, they used these machines a lot to make socks for the men overseas, especially during the First World War when they were in the trenches so much and they had such a time with their feet. This is a typical wartime sock made for the Army in the Army green. The Navy wanted navy blue and the Air Force wanted gray or green for theirs. And sock knitters made millions of socks for the men in both First and Second World War.
Well, welcome to the Sparta Church Museum. We are doing cleaning your clothes, and I'm doing from about 1850 to the turn of the century, just to show you the things that we have on display and how they would have been used. To start out with, first thing in the morning, a lady would get up and she would start her fire in her wood stove, and she would get her copper boiler out, fill it with water, and she would set it to boiling so that when she was ready to do her laundry after breakfast, the water would be all ready for her. Now she would have a lot of white clothes, such as our little pair of pantaloons we have here. And they wanted to keep these things white. And the only way they really could do it was they would put it in the boiling water, and then they would agitate it with an agitator or another type of a plunger like this. And they'd go in and then you just squish it around, squish them around. After a while, they would have to reach in, pull those clothes out because of course they're extremely hot, and they would come over and be put into a wash tub. It is at this point the washing will start. We take our soap and we shave it into the water to make some soap. So we're just going to talk a little bit about how in the very early days they would have made soap. It didn't come, you didn't go and buy it, you had to make it. It was a long process. First of all, they had to make lye. And lye, they would have saved their hardwood ashes over the winter, and they would have had a trough. They would have had them laid out in that, and they would have run rainwater through it. And as it seeped through, there would have been a small hole at the end, and what drained out was actually lye. As time went along, later on, mid-1800s, you could purchase lye. That made life much easier. They didn't have to produce their own lye. Now, they had to mix the lye with fat. So all winter, they would have a bucket in the cabin, saving all the fat scraps from the whole winter. Those were melted down. You would have it boiling. You would add your liquid lye into it, and you would have to stir it over a very large cast iron pot that was done outside in the spring because it was a very hot, long process. You would boil, and after a period of time, then you would take it off, let it cool, and you could form it into a soap bar. And that's why they would take their soap bar and they would have to shave it for any work they were doing. They didn't have bottles or anything. And now the hard work comes, where you have to take each item and you have to scrub and scrub and scrub. every piece, ins, out. It would take a long time just to scrub them. After you've scrubbed them, now you're going to do some more agitating. And agitating, this is an agitator, and these are agitators or plungers, as I had said before. And these, again, you just pressed it up and down. This one's a little squeaky, but... And then we have these others. Same thing. Bump it up and down. And now you would have fresh water that would be taken for your clothes, and they would all be rinsed out. Everything gets rinsed, and then it's time to put them through the wringers. Every lady had a different wringer. This one's quite early. This one would sit on the top of your wooden bucket or your wash bucket, and it literally, you would put your clothes through it, wring them out, just like that. That would dry them enough so that you were ready to put them in your laundry basket and be hung out on your line. This is a little later one from the early 1900s. And again, they would put their clothes through the roller and they would crank it, and that would squeeze all the water out, or as much as possible, and then it was ready for your wicker laundry basket. Well, now it's time to do some ironing. Again, a very hot and long job. Really, centuries ago, the Chinese would have their little Chinese iron, which is a smoothing iron. As you can see, it's flat. They would put charcoal in here. This particular one is from about 1650. Would have had a wooden ornate handle, and it was used for smoothing their silk. So that's one of the very, very earliest irons. Now, charcoal was in that. For every day came the charcoal iron. Very dirty iron, because you put your charcoal in here from the fire, and while you were ironing your clothes, you can imagine what was coming out of some of these holes. It was smoke and dirt and dust getting on your nice clean clothes. So they weren't very useful. Although they used them for a long time, they slowly changed, and I will explain that in a minute. This is another charcoal iron. This one's extremely heavy. This one is a tailor's iron. And a tailor would open it up, take his lid off, fill it with charcoal, and then put this down. And you can see where the smoke would come out here. And this iron, without the charcoal, weighs a lot. I can barely pick it up with both hands. That shows you how heavy it is, not even filled. So those are our charcoal irons. The sad iron is just a cast iron which was put onto the stove and heated. In this situation, we actually have an insert for your wood stove, and that is where you would put your iron into. It would heat up, and then you would bring it out. Now, of course, this got very hot, so you always had to have a hot pad to hold it. A little later on, they started to make them with wood handles that would detach, and a lady would have several of the bottoms heating, and then she would just clip on and take the next one she needed. So that is a sad iron, and every woman owned a sad iron. Now, many irons after that also had something called a slug in them, and that was to heat it up. This is a Dutch iron, a brass Dutch iron. Now this, when you open it up, and you can actually see where the slug would have gone in. And it would have been a big piece of cast iron that was heated and slid in there, and then that would have heated the bottom, hence an iron. Now, when your iron was hot, you didn't want to sit it anywhere and burn something, so you always had a trivet handy. And this is an iron trivet. It does say T on it. It's for Timothy Eaton, is what this trivet is. They had every kind of fancy ones, plain ones, but every lady had several of those to sit her pots on, sit anything on. Our next one is this little guy, who also takes a slug. You have to flip that. You open it up, and inside you would have, you pick this up. This is what would heat. This is called the slug. And then it would go in here, and on it would go, and you would be able to heat. Now, you could have several slugs heating, and then you could just change them up and put your handle back on. After that, we got gas irons or naphtha irons. And this, as you can see, looks kind of dangerous. It would carry the gas in here, and that's how that would have been heated up so you could iron. You didn't have to put this onto a stove. It was called a self-heating iron. And then came the first electric irons. And as you can see, this one has a plug that would have been plugged in, and it would have been a cord that would have gone to the electrical outlet. And as you can see, it has a piece in the middle and then the heavy piece on the bottom. It was just an electric current that would heat the iron. So there's your stages of different types of irons. There's still more work to be done when it comes to ironing for a lady. There was a lot of fluting and crimping to make your blouses and everything look the way they were supposed to prior to washing them. First though, I want to show you a little travel iron that a lady would carry with her. She would take this as she traveled, and she would open it up, coal from the fireplace. She would use this side, and when that side cooled, she would flip it over and use the other side. So it was very handy for her while she was traveling. Now we're going to detail those clothes. Ladies would have simple fluters or crimpers, and that's what these are. This one would have taken a slug, as I talked about before, heat it up, put it in, and then you would have sometimes cuffs, sometimes pieces that went on to blouses and shirts that had to be crimped again. And all they did was put it on, and it would go back and forth like that. And as you can see, it would crimp your clothes back into that ripple effect. This one does the same thing, only the whole piece sits on the fire or on the stove. And then you would just rock this one like this. And once again, your clothes would be set again, because those would always come out when you washed. So you had to put those pleat and crimpers back in. Also, ladies would have fluting irons like this. This one is a little detachable handle, so you could use more than one. And then you would just heat it and then hook it on. But this was for doing all these fancy little spots up in here to make your sleeves all come out pretty. That was what this little iron was. Up inside, and wherever they couldn't reach, they used a little fluting iron. So that was detailing. Now, some women, if they had a lot, or in an industrial area, they would have had a crimper like this one attached, and then you just put the clothing went right through, and this is what happened. Slugs went in here, and that's what heated the roller up so that it was hot for doing the crimping. But again, these are long rods, not flat slugs. And that's how that crimper would work. So there you go. We got our clothes all fancy and we're all back, and maybe that's brought us to the end of our day. A lot of work.
So we're going to deal with two common stains that would have been prevalent in the War of 1812. And for an officer such as myself, and these breeches, which are also made out of superfine wool, what I have is wine, and the wine has already started to set in. What we have here is a dish of Fuller's Earth. It's a very, very fine clay. It just has to be crushed, and all of the particles that are stone, grit, all of those kinds of things have to be removed so that it's an absolute powder. You can't put it on dry, so you have to use the miracle ingredient of the War of 1812. And it was also used by the Romans. Urine. And you want to make a paste with it. We now know why they used urine, because of the ammonia content, but they didn't know that in the 18th century. Let this dry for 24 hours, and then we're going to use a brush. You would brush your clothing, and if there were stains, you would use Fuller's Earth and then brush it off afterwards. So we've waited overnight. You can actually crack some of this and remove it with our fingers, which they would have done as well. What you don't want to do is you don't want to do to this fine piece of cloth what they normally do by boiling it and beating it with a stick in order to get the earth out. And you can see that that was the area where the butter was placed to indicate grease. And if you look at it, it's actually come out quite nicely. And you can also see that all of the wine stains are gone as well.